My name is Naomi Caldwell. I'm 38 years old, 3 days before my mother died of pancreatic cancer. My younger sister transferred $312,000 out of their joint savings account into her own name. She did it on a Tuesday. My mother was on a morphine drip. She was not conscious enough to sign her own name on a birthday card. Asterisk like and subscribe the channel and do comments for more stories. Asterisk 6 months later. Diane walked into probate court with a handwritten letter she claimed my mother had signed gifting her the entire account, and the lawyer who said I was a grieving woman who didn't understand estate law. What neither of them knew was that my mother had kept a shoebox. She had kept it in the back of her hospice closet, under a spare blanket, and she had told me about it 2 weeks before she stopped being able to speak. I am standing in that deposition room, and I am watching Diane's lawyer go completely still as our forensic examiner reads from his report. Asterisk. Before I tell you what was in that shoebox, hit subscribe, hit like, and let me take you back to the beginning. Asterisk, I want you to understand something about Ruth Caldwell before I tell you anything else about this story. She was not a soft woman. People who didn't know her well sometimes mistook her for cold, the way she held herself very straight when she walked, the way she never cried at movies, the way she could sit through the news without making a single sound. That wasn't coldness. That was the particular stillness of a woman who had survived things and decided the surviving was enough. She didn't need to perform it. My mother was 67 when she was diagnosed. She had retired 2 years earlier from 29 years as a high school librarian in Decatur, Georgia. She had raised 2 daughters mostly alone after my father left when I was 11 and Diane was 8. She had bought her house, a 3-bedroom, Craftsman on Peachtree Hills Avenue, with money she had saved for 11 years in a cigar box she kept inside a hollow encyclopedia volume. No, I am not exaggerating. The encyclopedia was Britannica. Volume 7. G through H. She was methodical in a way that only people who have been genuinely afraid of financial ruin understand. She kept receipts in labeled folders. She had a binder called Important Papers with clear plastic sleeves and typed labels. She reviewed her bank statements the first Saturday of every month and circled anything she didn't recognize in red pen. Then looked it up and wrote the explanation in the margin in pencil. I am a nurse practitioner. I have worked in palliative care at Emory St. Joseph's for 11 years. I have sat with families during some of the worst moments of their lives, and I have tried to make those moments survivable. I know what cancer looks like up close. I know what it sounds like, and what it smells like, and I know what it does to a person's body week by week in a way that is not something you carry lightly. When the oncologist at Northside Hospital called my mother in October and explained that what they had found was a stage 3 pancreatic adenocarcinoma, I was with her. I was sitting in the orange plastic chair to her left, and I was watching her face, and her face did not change. She asked 2 questions. She asked what the treatment options were, and she asked what the median survival timeline looked like for her specific presentation. The doctor told her. She nodded. She said, "All right." Asterisk in the car on the way home, she said to me, "Naomi, I need to get my affairs in order. I need you to help me with that." I said, "Mom, we don't need to talk about this today." She looked at me, that particular look, the one she had been giving me since I was a teenager, the one that meant I am not going to say this twice, and she said, "Yes, we do." I said, "Okay." So we started. I want to be precise about who my mother was in those first weeks after the diagnosis, because I need you to understand that she was not confused. She was not diminished. She was not a woman who could be led or manipulated or pressured into things without knowing she was being led. She was Ruth Caldwell. She had raised 2 children, alone on a librarian's salary, and she had $312,000 in savings because she had never bought anything she couldn't pay for in cash, and she had never spent $1 she didn't intend to spend. This is important. This is the thing I had to prove later, in a room with lawyers, with a judge reading documents, that the woman whose signature appeared on that letter was not the woman I knew. that the woman I knew would no more have handed over her life savings 3 days before she died than she would have handed over that cigar box of cash to a stranger on the street. She would not have done it in secret. She would not have done it without telling me. She would not have done it without having it typed and witnessed and notarized and filed. Because that was who she was. There is a photograph of my mother on my desk at work. She is standing in front of the library stacks holding a copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and she is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the book. Her expression is the expression of someone who has just remembered something wonderful. I look at that photograph on the days when I am very tired, on the days when this story has worn me out, and I think about what she would say if she could see how it all went. I think she would say, "You did what I told you," and she would be right. I did exactly what she told me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Diane. Diane Caldwell Hartley is 3 years younger than me. She is 35 in this story. She works, or she worked then, in marketing for a mid-sized property management company in Buckhead. Her husband is Kevin Hartley. Kevin installs VHE systems and coaches Little League on weekends and has, as far as I can tell, never had a single original thought about anything in his entire life. He is not an evil man. He is a man who does what Diane tells him because it is easier than not doing what Diane tells him. And because he has decided that easy is the organizing principle of his life, I don't want to make Diane into a cartoon. That would be easy and it would also be wrong. And this story is complicated enough without me making it simple. Diane and I were not close as adults. We had been when we were girls. We shared a bedroom until I left for college, and I remember those years with genuine warmth. The way she used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. The way she could make me laugh harder than anyone else. The way she used to read to me from this battered copy of a fairy tale anthology she'd gotten at a school book fair. We were close the way siblings are close when they are the only two people in the house with the same mother and the same grief and the same understanding that things are tight. But we are fine, and then I went to college. Then nursing school. Then a job in Atlanta, which was only 40 minutes from where we grew up, but which might as well have been a different planet for how infrequently I came home those first years. I was building something. That is not an excuse. It is just true. Diane stayed closer. She and Kevin bought a house in Marietta, 20 minutes from our mother. She had dinner with her on Sundays. She was, by the conventional accounting, the daughter who showed up. The present one. I'm not going to argue with that accounting. I wasn't present enough and I knew it, and it sat in me like a stone. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing until later, was what the shape of that presence actually looked like. What Diane was doing with her proximity. In the 2 years before the diagnosis, my mother lent Diane and Kevin $44,000. I know this because of the important papers binder. There were promissory notes, typed, signed, dated with a repayment schedule for 3 separate amounts. $18,000 in January of the year before the diagnosis. $16,000 6 months later. $10,000 in March. The note said the loans were for home repairs and then for Kevin's business expansion and then for unspecified family expenses. Not 1 penny had been repaid. My mother had not told me about any of it when I found the binder. After the diagnosis, when we sat down together to go through her papers, I saw the notes and I asked her about them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Diane needed help. I said, Mom, that's almost $50,000. She said, 44. I said, has she paid any of it back? My mother said, she's going to. There was something in how she said it. Not reassurance. Something more like a decision she had made a long time ago. To believe something because the alternative was too painful. She was looking at the table, not at me. I said, okay. I didn't push it. I didn't ask the follow-up questions I should have asked. I told myself it was her money and her choice, and her relationship with her younger daughter and I was not going to make her last months about money. That was the first mistake. But here's what I want you to understand. Even if I had pushed, I don't know what would have changed. Because Diane was already operating. She had already identified exactly what she wanted, and she was already moving toward it. Quietly and methodically, in a way that my mother would not have seen as a threat because it looked, from the outside, like love. She came over twice a week. She drove my mother to her first round of oncology appointments. She organized the medicine schedule. She was competent and present and warm, and my mother, who was 67 and tired and afraid in the private way she never showed anyone, was grateful. I live 40 minutes away and I work 50 hours a week in palliative care. Diane was there. I am going to tell you about the month of February. My mother started hospice care in late January. It was not a facility, it was a hospice at-home service, which meant that the primary location was her house on Peachtree Hills Avenue, with a hospice nurse named Gloria checking in 3 times a week and a home health aide named Patricia there most mornings. In early February, the decision was made to transition her to the Peachtree Hospice inpatient facility on Dresden Drive because the pain management had become more complex than could be handled at home. I had been driving out to see her every other day. On the days I couldn't come, I called. I want to be clear about this because it was used against me later. The suggestion, implied by Diane's layer and never stated outright but always hovering, that I had been an absent daughter who only appeared at the end. I was not absent. I was there within the limits of what my schedule allowed, and I was in contact every single day. The first thing I noticed, and I noticed it without naming it, the way you notice something wrong with the light in a room without immediately identifying why, was the finances. My mother's memory was still sharp in early February. She could tell me what she'd eaten for breakfast, and what time Gloria had come, and the full name and author of the last book she'd read, before the pain made reading too difficult. But she told me in the second week of February that she was confused about the bank. I said, "What do you mean confused?" Asterisk, she said. I asked Diane to check my balance and she said everything was fine, but when I called the bank myself, they said something I didn't understand. I said, "What did they say?" She said, "They said I should talk to the account holder." I said, "Mom, you're the account holder." She said, "That's what I thought. I'm a palliative care nurse. I know what medication does to cognition, and I know how to distinguish medication fog from something else." My mother at that moment was not confused. Asterisk, she was describing something specific, with clear language, and the thing she was describing was impossible. I said, "Mom, do you want me to call the bank with you?" She said, "I think maybe Diane handles it now." The temperature in that room. I don't have a word for it. The air changed. I looked at my mother's face, and she was looking out the window, and her face had the expression of a woman who has decided not to look at something too closely. I said, "What do you mean Diane handles it?" She said, "She's been helping me with the finances since October. She said it would be easier." I said, "Did you add her to the account?" My mother said, "I think so. I think there were papers." I want you to understand, I did not panic. I did not make a scene. I am a nurse. I sat very still and I said, "Okay, Mom, that's fine. I'll sort it out with Diane." And I left the room and I stood in the hallway and I felt something I am going to describe as very cold clarity. Not anger. Not yet. Just clarity, the specific, focused kind that comes from suddenly being able to see the shape of a thing. I called Diane. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was perfectly, fluently warm. "Nay. How's she doing today?" "I was going to come by tomorrow." I said, "Diane, are you on Mom's bank account?" A pause, very brief. Maybe 1 second. Then, "Yeah, I am." It just made more sense with everything going on, you know? She needed someone to handle the day-to-day stuff, the bills and everything. I said, "When did that happen?" She said, "Back in the fall." She asked me to. I said, "She didn't mention it to me." Diane said, "Naomi." Her voice shifted, not hard, not sharp, but careful. The careful voice of someone placing their words very precisely. "I know you're scared. We're all scared. But Mom asked me to do this. I'm not going to apologize for helping her." Asterisk, I said, "I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to show me the account. She said, Naomi, I don't think this is the right time. I said, when is the right time? She didn't answer that. The call ended a few minutes later, friendly on the surface, nothing resolved. She promised we would sit down together and go through everything, and I said fine, and we agreed on a day. And the day came and she canceled because Kevin had a thing. She canceled 3 times. The 4th time I stopped asking. I started documenting. I have a notes app on my phone. And from February 14th onward. I know the date because it was Valentine's Day, and I remember thinking that was a bitter coincidence. I began keeping a log. Every conversation, every canceled meeting, everything my mother said about the bank, however small, however easily explained away as medication confusion, I wrote everything down. That habit saved everything. But I didn't know that yet. Asterisk, my mother died on a Saturday in March. She died at 4:17 in the morning. In room 12 of the Peachtree Hospice facility. With Patricia, the health aide, in the room and me on the phone, I had been called at 3:50 and I made it to the parking lot at 4:24. 7 minutes too late, and I sat in my car for a long time before I went in. She had been unconscious for the last 4 days. The last real conversation I had with her was on the Tuesday before. It was a short conversation. She was tired and her words were slow, and she squeezed my hand more than she talked. But at one point, she said something that I wrote down immediately. Verbatim, in my phone the moment she fell asleep, she said, "The shoebox is in my closet. Under the blanket. Don't let her tell you it's gone." I didn't understand what it meant. I thought it might be the medication. I wrote it down anyway. Asterisk, the morning after she died. A Sunday. I went to her hospice room before anyone else arrived to collect her belongings. I went early on purpose. I have thought about whether that was intuition or planning, and I honestly do not know. Maybe both. The closet was a small built-in with a sliding door. Her clothes were hanging on one side, the blue cardigan she'd asked us to bring, her good winter coat, 2 pairs of slippers. On the floor, pushed to the back right corner, was a tan wool blanket folded neatly. I lifted it. There was a shoebox. It was a DSW shoebox, black lid, from a pair of comfort flats she'd bought in 2021. And it was not empty. But before I tell you what was inside it, I need to tell you about the transfer. Because that came first. 11 days before my mother died. On that Tuesday, 3 days before she lost consciousness. Diane transferred $312,000 from their joint savings account into a personal checking account held solely in Diane's name at a different bank. I did not know this when it happened. I found out 6 weeks after my mother's death, when I finally got access to the account statements as part of the estate process. Going to tell you what I felt when I saw that line item. That date, that amount, I felt nothing for about 30 seconds. My brain refused it. Then I felt a physical sensation in my chest that I can only describe as something shutting, like a door very carefully and firmly closing. And then I felt, with total clarity and zero hysteria, the following thought: she did it while Mom was alive. She waited until Mom couldn't tell anyone. The timing was deliberate. I understood that immediately. Diane hadn't waited until after the death because a transfer after death would be clearly illegal. An unauthorized withdrawal from an estate. But a transfer while the account holder was technically still living, if there was a signed authorization of some kind, could be argued as a gift. A legal transfer. As long as there was documentation. Which it turned out there was 2 weeks after. I found the transfer. Diane's attorney contacted our probate attorney and submitted what they called a gift letter. It was a single, handwritten page on my mother's personal stationery, the cream paper with the small blue flower border that she had ordered from an Etsy shop 2 years earlier and used for thank you notes. It stated, in handwriting identified as my mother's, that she was gifting the full balance of the joint account, approximately $312,000, to her daughter Diane Hartley as a lifetime gift, and that this was her free and voluntary wish. It was dated February 22 ND. My mother on February 22nd was in the Peachtree Hospice inpatient facility. She had been there for almost 2 weeks. On February 22nd, according to the nursing notes I requested, I am a nurse. I know how to read and request those notes. She had received her morning morphine at 7 a.m. and an additional comfort dose at noon. The nursing note for that afternoon described her as resting comfortably. Minimally responsive to verbal stimulation. Minimally responsive to verbal stimulation. That is the person who supposedly sat up and wrote a clear, coherent, legally structured gift letter on a specific date. In neat cursive with complete sentences, on the correct stationery dot, my probate attorney. Her name is Vivian Marsh. And she is one of the most methodical and unflappable women I have ever met. Looked at the letter for a long time. When I brought it to her, then she looked at me. She said, "Naomi, we need to get this examined." I said, "I know." She said, "This is going to be a process. It's going to take time, and it's going to cost money. Are you sure you want to do this?" I thought about my mother in that hospital bed, her hand in mine, saying, "Don't let her tell you it's gone," I said. Yes. Asterisk, I want to tell you what was in the shoebox now. Because the shoebox is the center of this story. Everything else, the lawyers, the examiner, the deposition, it all radiates out from what was inside a DSW box under a wool blanket in a hospice closet. There were 7 items. The first was a small spiral notebook, the kind you get at the dollar store. 3 by 5 inches, the cover a plain dark green. My mother's handwriting filled maybe 30 pages of it. The entries were dated. They ran from December of the previous year through the last week of February. Asterisk. The second was a folded printout of a bank statement. Specifically, the statement for the joint savings account. The month of January. My mother had circled 2 items in red pen and written in the margin. In her clear, slanted librarian's hand, Diane did not ask me. The third was a letter she had written to me. Not dated. 2 pages. I am not going to read you the contents of that letter. That's mine. But I will tell you that it was clear and coherent and specific, and it was written in the handwriting of a woman who was fully present when she wrote it. The fourth was the original copy of her will, which she had asked her own attorney to prepare in November, not through Diane. Not through Kevin, through her own attorney, whose card was paper-clipped to the front page. The fifth was a copy of the power of attorney document that Diane had had my mother sign in October. My mother had written, in red pen in the margin of page 3, a single word, mistake. The sixth was a receipt from a notary public. Dated November 12th, the description of services, notarization of account, authorization documents. The 7th was a note card, the small kind. The one she used when she was writing something she expected a person to keep. 3 sentences. My name at the top. And then, I know something is wrong. I know I can't fix it now. You're the one who knows how to fight. I sat on the floor of that hospice closet and, I held that note card for a long time. Here's what that shoebox told me. My mother had known. Not everything. She had not known the full extent. She had not known the $312,000. She had not known exactly how far Diane had taken it. But she had known that something was being done to her that she had not agreed to. She had known in November. She had known in December. She had been documenting it in a dollar store notebook for 3 months, quietly, methodically. The same way she had circled unexplained bank items in red pen for 30 years, she had known. And she had been increasingly incapacitated. And she had trusted me to find it. She had told me. She had told me in the last real conversation we had, with 4 days of life left in her. On a Tuesday afternoon when she was exhausted and her words were slow, the shoebox is in my closet. Under the blanket. Don't let her tell you it's gone. I called Vivian Marsh from the hospice parking lot. It was 8:47 in the morning on a Sunday. She answered, which tells you something about Vivian. I said, I found something. She said, tell me. I told her. There was a silence on the line. Then Vivian said, in a very calm voice, take photographs of every single item before you move anything. High resolution. Then bring me the originals. I said, today? She said, today. Asterisk Margaret Osei was my mother's next-door neighbor on Peachtree Hills Avenue for 22 years. She is 64, originally from Accra, retired from the Fulton County school system, and she makes the best jollof rice I have ever eaten in my life. She and my mother used to drink tea together on Saturday mornings through a shared gap in the fence, passing the cups through to each other, a practice so specific and consistent that I thought of it as a ceremony. I called Margaret 2 weeks after the funeral. I was not yet sure what I was looking for. I called her because my mother had trusted her more than almost anyone, and because the notebook mentioned her name twice, we met at her kitchen table. She poured tea without asking, the way she always had, and she looked at me very steadily across the table and she said, "I was wondering when you'd call." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Your mother talked to me. In January, before things got worse." She paused, folding her hands around her cup. She asked me to remember something. My heart was doing something peculiar. I said, "What did she ask you to remember?" Margaret said, "She asked me to remember that she had not signed any papers giving away her house. She said she wanted someone to know that." She paused again. She was very precise about it. She said, "Margaret, I want you to know that I did not agree to this. She asked me if I would say so if someone asked me."
I said, "Did Diane know she'd talk to you?" Margaret said, "No. Your sister stopped coming to see your mother by herself around December. Kevin came sometimes, but Diane would only come when you were also there, after a certain point." I looked at her. I said, "Why do you think that was?" Margaret said, "Because your mother had stopped being easy with her. I could see it over the fence. The visits had a different quality. Your mother would be very still when Diane left." I said, "Still how?" Margaret looked out her kitchen window for a moment. She said, "The way a person is still when they've just realized something they can't undo." I wrote all of this down. I had been writing everything down since February 14th, but this was different. This was a witness. This was a person who had spoken directly to my mother, who had been specifically asked by my mother to remember a specific fact, and who was willing to say so. I asked Margaret if she would be willing to speak to my attorney. She said, "I already told you I would. Your mother asked me. I don't make promises I don't keep." There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from being seen, from being understood, from having someone else confirm the thing you have been carrying alone. I felt it then, at Margaret Osei's kitchen table with tea I couldn't taste, looking at this woman who had passed cups through a fence to my mother for 22 years. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Win." I need to tell you about the last real day, the Tuesday before she lost consciousness, the last time my mother was present with me in the way that she had always been present, fully, specifically, entirely herself. It was raining. I remember the sound of it against the hospice window, that particular rhythm of rain on glass in a warm room that would under any other circumstance have been peaceful. Patricia was in the building somewhere. The room had a smell, the particular medicinal floral smell that every inpatient room develops, underneath which, faintly, was the smell of my mother's hand cream, eucalyptus. She had used the same hand cream for 30 years. I sat in the chair beside her bed. She was awake. Her eyes were open and clear, the clarity that came in the mornings before the afternoon doses. Her hands were on the blanket in front of her, and I held one of them, and we did not talk for a while, which was fine. We had always been capable of quiet together. Then she said, "You're so much like me." I said, "I know, you've told me." She said, "It's not a complaint." I said, "I know, Mom." She turned her head and looked at me. Her eyes were dark brown, very direct, the look that had never changed from the time I was a child. She said, "You're going to be angry." I said, "I'm already angry." She said, "Not at her, or not only at her, at me, for not telling you sooner." I said, "Mom." She said, I know you'll say you understand. You do understand. but you're still going to be angry, and I want you to know that's allowed." She turned back toward the window. I thought I could handle it myself. I thought I could tell her to stop, and she would stop. A pause. She was my daughter. I thought I knew her. I did not cry. I am telling you this not to establish anything about my strength or composure, but because it is true. I did not cry, and that surprised me. What I felt instead was very large and very heavy, and I held her hand and pressed it carefully, and she squeezed back. She said, "The shoebox is in my closet, under the blanket. Don't let her tell you it's gone." I said, "I'll find it." She said, "I know." An hour later, she was asleep. I sat there for another 40 minutes because I didn't want to leave. I watched her breathing, and I listened to the rain, and I thought about the gap in the fence, and the cups of tea, and the encyclopedia with the cigar box inside, and the red pen circles on bank statements. I thought about the note card she had written me. "You're the one who knows how to fight." She was right. I did know how to fight. I just had never had to fight for her before. Vivian Marsh is 61, a probate attorney with 30 years in Atlanta family law, and she has the kind of face that gives absolutely nothing away in a meeting. She would be a formidable poker player. She's also kind, specifically and practically, not warm in a performed way, but in the way of someone who has sat across from a lot of grieving people and has decided that clarity is a form of kindness. She laid everything out for me in our second meeting after she had reviewed the shoebox materials, the bank records I had obtained, the gift letter, and the nursing notes from February 22nd documenting minimal responsiveness, the contents of the shoebox, most critically the notebook, the annotated bank statement, and the signed note card to me, Margaret Osei's account of her January conversation with my mother, and the original will prepared through her own attorney naming her estate to be divided equally between her two daughters. What we needed was an expert opinion on the gift letter itself, because Diane's case rested entirely on the authenticity of that letter. If the letter was genuine, the transfer was arguably lawful, an imperfect process, but not a criminal one. If the letter was not genuine, everything changed. Vivian said, "I want to bring in a forensic document examiner. The question is whether your mother's handwriting on that letter is consistent with her handwriting in February." I said, "You mean whether she actually wrote it?" Vivian said, "Whether she wrote it in the condition she was in on the date it bears." I provided the comparison documents, the notebook, dated entries through late February, the note card to me, letters and notes from earlier periods for baseline comparison. Vivian sent everything to Dr. Frederick Amoa, a certified forensic document examiner who had testified in federal court 12 times and whose reports, I was told, were thorough to the point of uncomfortable. Dr. Amoa came back 4 weeks later. His report was 43 pages. I'm going to tell you the conclusion, which Vivian read to me over the phone. He wrote that the handwriting on the gift letter was, in his expert opinion, inconsistent with the handwriting samples from the notebook and note card, which bear dates in mid to late February, and which themselves were consistent with controlled but slightly degraded fine motor function under morphine management. He wrote that the gift letter bore signs of effortful imitation rather than natural authorship. He did not say, "This is a forgery." That is not language a forensic examiner uses. What he said was something more careful and more devastating. The evidence does not support the conclusion that this document was written spontaneously by the identified author under the conditions prevailing on its stated date. Vivian read that sentence to me. I was sitting in my car in the hospice parking lot. I was very still. Then I said, "That's enough, isn't it?" Vivian said, "In combination with everything else, yes, I think it is." I want to be honest about what the weeks between receiving Dr. Amoa's report and the deposition were like, because they were not triumphant. They were exhausting in a way that I had not anticipated, not the sharp exhaustion of crisis, but the long, dull exhaustion of a process that moves slowly and requires your attention at all times. Diane knew something was happening. She had been served with the formal challenge to the estate distribution, and her attorney had responded with what Vivian described as a robust counterfiling, language I came to understand meant they were going to fight. Diane's attorney was a man named Gordon Fitch. He was perhaps 50, with very good shoes, and the specific energy of a man who had won enough cases to believe that winning was the natural state of things. He filed objections to our expert designation and submitted his own handwriting analysis, a countering opinion from a different examiner who found the letter consistent with the stated author.
Vivian said, "One of them is wrong." I said, "Which one?" She said, "That's what deposition is for." In the meantime, my mother's house remained frozen in probate, untouched, unsold, unsettled. I drove past it once in early May and stopped the car and sat there for a while. The yard needed cutting. The rose bush on the left side of the porch had bloomed without anyone there to see it. The hardest part of those months, harder than the legal process, harder than the waiting, was the thing I couldn't say out loud to almost anyone. My sister had forged my dying mother's signature on a letter designed to steal her life savings. Or my sister had not forged it, and somehow our mother, minimally responsive to verbal stimulation, had sat up and written a coherent legal document on the correct stationery on the exact same day that happened to precede by 11 days a $312,000 transfer into Diane's account. There was no middle. There was no version of the story where Diane was simply misguided or confused or operating from a mistaken belief. Whatever had happened, it had been calculated. It had been planned. I knew my sister, and I knew that she did not do things without planning them. I had one conversation with Kevin during those months. He called me in April unexpectedly, and he said, "Naomi, this is getting out of hand." I said, "It got out of hand when $312,000 disappeared 3 days before Mom died." He said, "Diane says..." I said, "Kevin, I know you know." A long silence. Then he said, "I can't..." He stopped. Then he said, "I hope this ends well for your family." I said, "Which family?" He hung up. I wrote it down. The deposition was on a Thursday in July at Gordon Fitch's office in Buckhead. Vivian and I arrived 15 minutes early, which is Vivian's practice, and we sat in the conference room and she went through the sequence one more time and I drank terrible coffee from a paper cup and looked out the window at the street. Diane arrived with Kevin and Gordon Fitch. She was wearing a dark navy blazer and her hair was neat, and she looked at me when she came in with an expression I had been seeing my entire life. The expression that said, "You are making this harder than it needs to be." The expression that had, when we were teenagers, meant, "You are embarrassing me." The expression that had always made me feel, briefly, that I was the difficult one. I looked back at her. I did not look away first. The deposition proceeded through 3 hours of foundational material: the timeline, the account history, the circumstances of my mother's illness, the chain of documents related to the joint account authorization in October. Gordon Fitch was methodical and controlled. He asked questions about my mother's cognition, her relationship with Diane, her stated wishes regarding the account. Then it was time for Dr. Amoa. He testified by video, the screen at the end of the conference table, his face calm and specific in the way of expert witnesses who have done this many times. Gordon Fitch was not happy about the video arrangement and had objected to it twice and been overruled both times. Dr. Amoa walked through his methodology in careful, unhurried detail. He explained the comparison documents. He explained the specific characteristics he had analyzed. He used clinical language that was also, somehow, completely clear to a non-specialist, which is a skill I recognized from my own field, the skill of translating something complex into something a person can hold. He arrived at his conclusions. He read the sentence. "The evidence does not support the conclusion that this document was written spontaneously by the identified author under the conditions prevailing on its stated date." Gordon Fitch said, "Dr. Amoa, can you characterize the degree of certainty with which you hold this opinion?" Dr. Amoa said, "High." Gordon Fitch said. And you acknowledge that another qualified examiner reached a different conclusion? Dr. Amoa said, I am aware of the counter report. I have reviewed it. My conclusion stands. Then Vivian asked her questions. She asked Dr. Amoa to walk through, specifically, the pen pressure differential between the gift letter and the notebook entries. She asked him to identify the dates of the notebook entries for the record. She asked him to describe what specific motor challenges late-stage morphine management typically produces in handwriting, and she asked him to identify which characteristics of those challenges were present in the notebook and absent from the gift letter. He answered all of it. Then, Vivian put the note card on the table. My mother's note card, the one from the shoebox. You're the one who knows how to fight. Vivian said, Dr. Amoa, when was this note card written based on your analysis? He said, consistent with the mid-February period, approximately 10 days before the date on the gift letter. She said, and in your analysis, does the motor profile of this note card align more closely with the gift letter or with the other late February samples? He said, with the other late February samples. She said, meaning the gift letter is the outlier. He said, yes. I looked at Diane. She was looking at the table. Kevin's hand was on her arm. Gordon Fitch was writing something on his yellow pad, but he had gone very still in the shoulders, the stillness of a man recalculating. It was very quiet in that room. I thought of my mother at that Saturday kitchen table in December, reviewing her bank statements with her red pen, circling what didn't belong. I thought, she taught me how to do this. The case did not go to full trial. I want to be honest about that. The outcome was not a courtroom verdict with a gavel and a judge announcing numbers. It was a mediated settlement, which is how most of these cases end. Vivian had explained this to me at the beginning and had continued to manage my expectations throughout, and I had tried to hold on to those managed expectations, even in the months when I wanted something larger and louder and more defined. In August, 6 weeks after the deposition, Gordon Fitch's office contacted Vivian with a settlement offer, $210,000. Vivian called me and told me the number, and then she was quiet for a moment, which was her way of giving me space to react. I said, "What do you think?" Vivian said, "I think it reflects that they know their case got significantly weaker after the deposition. It also reflects that criminal referral is not yet off the table, and they know that." I said, "Is it enough?" Vivian said, "No, it is not everything she took. It is not everything your mother had. But it will fund the remainder of the estate and allow you to close probate, and it removes the uncertainty of what a judge decides." She paused. "Naomi, I want to be honest with you. Cases like this are never fully resolved in money. The money is a proxy for something else." I knew what the something else was. It was acknowledgement. It was the record, the fact that a forensic examiner had said in a deposition in front of lawyers and a court reporter that the letter did not hold up, the fact that Gordon Fitch had gone still in the shoulders. I thought of my mother at that Saturday kitchen table in December, reviewing her bank statements with her red pen, circling what didn't belong. I thought, she taught me how to do this. The case did not go to full trial. I want to be honest about that. The outcome was not a courtroom verdict with a gavel and a judge announcing numbers. It was a mediated settlement, which is how most of these cases end. Vivian had explained this to me at the beginning and had continued to manage my expectations throughout, and I had tried to hold on to those managed expectations, even in the months when I wanted something larger and louder and more defined. In August, 6 weeks after the deposition, Gordon Fitch's office contacted Vivian with a settlement offer, $210,000. Vivian called me and told me the number, and then she was quiet for a moment, which was her way of giving me space to react. I said, "What do you think?" Vivian said, "I think it reflects that they know their case got significantly weaker after the deposition. It also reflects that criminal referral is not yet off the table, and they know that." I said, "Is it enough?" Vivian said, No, it is not everything she took. It is not everything your mother had. But it will fund the remainder of the estate and allow you to close probate, and it removes the uncertainty of what a judge decides. She paused. Naomi, I want to be honest with you. Cases like this are never fully resolved in money. The money is a proxy for something else. I knew what the something else was. It was acknowledgement. It was the record, the fact that a forensic examiner had said in a deposition in front of lawyers and a court reporter that the letter did not hold up, the fact that Gordon Fitch had gone still in the shoulders. I thought of my mother at that Saturday kitchen table in December, reviewing her bank statements with her red pen, circling what didn't belong. I thought, she taught me how to do this. The case did not go to full trial. I want to be honest about that. The outcome was not a courtroom verdict with a gavel and a judge announcing numbers. It was a mediated settlement, which is how most of these cases end. Vivian had explained this to me at the beginning and had continued to manage my expectations throughout, and I had tried to hold on to those managed expectations, even in the months when I wanted something larger and louder and more defined. In August, 6 weeks after the deposition, Gordon Fitch's office contacted Vivian with a settlement offer, $210,000. Vivian called me and told me the number, and then she was quiet for a moment, which was her way of giving me space to react. I said, "What do you think?" Vivian said, "I think it reflects that they know their case got significantly weaker after the deposition. I think it also reflects that criminal referral is not yet off the table, and they know that." I said, "Is it enough?" Vivian said, "No, it is not everything she took. It is not everything your mother had, but it will fund the remainder of the estate and allow you to close probate, and it removes the uncertainty of what a judge decides." She paused. "Naomi, I want to be honest with you. Cases like this are never fully resolved in money. The money is a proxy for something else." I knew what the something else was. It was acknowledgement. It was the record. The fact that a forensic examiner had said in a deposition in front of lawyers and a court reporter that the letter did not hold up. The fact that Gordon Fitch had gone still in the shoulders. I said, "Does she have to admit anything?" Vivian said, "No. The settlement is with no admission of wrongdoing." I held the phone for a moment. Outside my apartment window, the summer was fully present, thick and green, the sound of someone's lawnmower in the distance. I said, "Take it." We finalized in September, $210,000 returned to the estate, distributed according to my mother's actual will, which meant half to me, half to Diane. I received $105,000 from the settlement, plus my share of the remaining estate assets, including the house. Diane received the same. She received money she had tried to steal, returned to her as a legal distribution, after having paid her lawyer and the settlement amount from what she'd taken. I do not know if she felt that as ironic. I hope she did. My mother's house on Peachtree Hills Avenue sold in November. I had spent 2 weekends cleaning it out, which is a specific and grief-soaked process that I won't romanticize. There's nothing cleanly emotional about sorting through 30 years of someone's accumulated life. It is physical and slow, and there are moments of genuine recognition and long flat stretches of just moving things into boxes. I kept the important papers binder. I kept the encyclopedia, volume G through H. I kept the hand cream. I kept the photograph from my desk, though I moved it from work to home. I wanted her in my living room now, looking at the book, looking at the things she loved. The dollar store notebook is in a fireproof lockbox in my closet. I have not opened it since the settlement. I don't know if I ever will, but I will not throw it away. Diane and I have not spoken since the settlement. Kevin called once, 6 months after, and left a voicemail I did not return. I do not wish either of them anything spectacular in either direction. I'm aware that this may change over years. I'm aware that grief is not static and that family estrangements rarely feel as simple as they look in their early phase. What I know now is this. Margaret Osei and I have tea on Saturdays. Not through the fence, there is no shared fence anymore. We meet at her kitchen table, the way we did when she told me about my mother in January. She has a photograph of my mother on her fridge, Ruth in the garden, squinting at the sun. Whenever I sit at that table, I can look at it. Gordon Fitch's counter-examiner filed a complaint against Dr. Amoa's report with the relevant professional body. The complaint was reviewed and dismissed. Vivian closed the case and sent me a brief handwritten note, the kind on a small card, the kind designed to be kept. It said, "Your mother knew what she was doing when she raised you." I put it in the fireproof box with the notebook. There is a cigar box on my kitchen shelf. It is not the original one, that box is long gone, and the encyclopedia it lived in is in my closet, not on my shelf. This one I bought at a craft store, dark wood, plain. It sits next to a small plant I keep alive with varying degrees of success. The box is empty. I bought it because I wanted the reminder, the specific reminder of a woman who put cash in a box and left it in a book for 11 years, because she was building towards something real. The reminder that patience and documentation and the refusal to let things disappear quietly is not weakness. It is the specific form of power available to people who cannot afford other forms. My mother did not fight back in the way I fought back. She was dying. She had weeks, and she spent them putting things in a shoebox so that I could find them. She documented. She circled things in red. She asked Margaret to remember. She gave me the tools. I used them. This is not a story about perfect justice. The money she saved over 40 years was not fully returned. No one went to prison. Diane Hartley received $105,000 from her mother's estate, and she lives in her house in Marietta, and I assume she goes on with her life. That is what settlements mean. That is what no admission of wrongdoing means. But there is a deposition transcript in the Fulton County probate records. It contains Dr. Hamoa's testimony. It will remain there. The record exists. And I have the note card. You're the one who knows how to fight. She was right. If you watched this whole story, I want to tell you something directly. Financial exploitation of a dying or elderly parent is more common than most families want to believe. It is almost never done by strangers. It is done by someone with access, someone who was trusted, someone who had been there, someone who built proximity into an advantage and then used it when the window was open. The tools that stopped it in this story were not dramatic. They were a notebook, a shoebox, a lawyer who understood probate, a neighbor who had been asked to remember one specific thing, a forensic examiner with 43 pages of methodology. If you are currently in a situation where you suspect something is being done to a parent or loved one, here are 3 things that are worth doing immediately. Request bank records. In most states, as a potential heir or person with documented financial power of attorney, you have the right to request transaction histories. Do it in writing. Document the request. Keep your own log. Dates, what was said, what was observed, who was present. The Notes app on your phone is enough. Start now. Talk to a probate or elder law attorney before anything reaches a crisis point. Many offer a free first consultation. You do not need to be certain that something is wrong before you ask questions. Your mother's story, or your father's, or your grandmother's deserves to be part of the record. So does yours. If any part of what I described today sounds like something you have lived through, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments. Not because I have advice to give, but because this kind of thing happens in silence, and it should not. If this story was worth your time, hit subscribe. New episodes every week. And the next story I'm going to tell you now involves a business partner, a backdated contract, and a notary stamp that turned out to be 11 days too early. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.